Okay, so there'll be a bit of overlap with what David just said, but maybe my take on some of the things a little bit different. So as David mentioned, and as you probably all know, the last 10, 15 years, so there's been this explosion of very interesting, important research on moral psychology. And as a moral philosopher speaking, that's obviously a very welcome development. Less obviously welcome, and in many ways very puzzling, is the absolutely central role that these trolley dilemmas have been playing in quite a lot of this research. Obviously not in all of it, but it's by far the dominant paradigm, so probably hundreds of studies using it by now, I would say. There's sometimes every month, every week, that some new things come up using this trolley thing. And that's very puzzling in many ways, because if your aim was to identify the basic psychological building blocks of human morality, it's really a weird place to start. It's not a fruit fly, it's pretty complex and very strange. Why is this strange focus? Well, one reason is kind of sociological, I suppose. One of the first neuroimaging studies of moral cognition, the study by Greene in 2001, used these dilemmas, was published in Science, report all these very controversial, exciting results, and was received a huge amount of attention. Very quickly, people started copying that, and then after a while, people just use the paradigm because everybody else does, which is not a great reason. And Greene did report some pretty striking results. So, kind of David mentioned that. The idea that these deontological responses to these dilemmas were based on gut reaction and emotion, and by contrast, it's coming from a slightly later neuroimaging study, that the utilitarian responses are based in reason, maybe uniquely based in reason and deliberative processing. And Greene proposed this general account, dual process account of the moral mind, based on this division, just based on these trolley dilemmas. And I mean, that's interesting enough, but Greene didn't stop here. He made all kind of historical and normative claims. So he claimed at some point that this whole historical controversy between deontologists like Kant and utilitarians like Bentham and Mill is really based on some tension between competing neural subsystems. And as David just mentioned, Greene and people like Peter Singer, maybe the most famous utilitarian alive today, have been trying to use some of these claims or Greene's findings to support utilitarianism. Most recently, I think Greene has tried to do that in this popular book, Moral Tribes. So you can see why psychologists or neuroscience find this whole trolley thing very exciting and important. You can address these big philosophical issues, maybe support some side on a big long-standing philosophical debate. That sounds pretty exciting. I've spent quite a bit of time over the past years criticizing quite a bit of the empirical and normative claim that Greene has made. Don't have time to go into the detail, but I actually think this dual process model, with all of its attraction and kind of impressive, it's full of methodological, conceptual, and empirical problems. I don't have time to go into too much detail here, but I'll just give you two examples of some stuff we've done that's relevant. In one neuroimaging study we did a few years ago, we found that this kind of supposedly utilitarian judgment, you should push the fat man, turn out to have very similar brain areas associated with them to what you might call ultra-deontological judgment, was exactly the opposite direction, such as refusing to lie to prevent some great harm. So judgment of completely different content seem to have the same kind of brain areas associated with them, which we took to suggest that it's really the counterintuitiveness of a certain judgment that was doing the work here, and it has actually very little to do with utilitarianism or deontology specifically. In another study, it's a bit more puzzling in its result, but kind of relevant. It's a psychopharmacological study where essentially we artificially reduce the gut reaction component of people's emotional response. And on the Greene theory, you'd expect people to be super utilitarian suddenly. We actually got, and like I said, it's a puzzling result, that they became more deontological, whatever that means. So there's just examples of problem with the theory. But what I want to talk about in the time I have is something a bit more general, so some underlying assumption that certainly fundamental to what Greene is trying to do, but I think are shared by a lot of the people in psychology or cognitive science are using these dilemmas. So there's this common assumption that these dilemmas, actually, I should mention in passing, they do distinguish utilitarian and non-utilitarian views, but there's a kind of common assumption that they were designed to do that by philosophy. In fact, that's not what philosophy actually designed these dilemmas to do. There are lots of other examples that philosophers came up with that trying to distinguish utilitarian and non-utilitarian views, but strangely enough, this whole psychological literature has tended to ignore these examples and pick on these ones that actually are part of some debate within a specific strand of deontology. But let's set this aside because it might think that utilitarianism does offer a different solution to the Footbridge case than most people who seem to have deontological views would endorse. But so let's set this problem aside. But there's kind of two fundamental assumptions that are really just grab this glass of water. They're pretty much shared by this whole body of work that if you give these dilemmas to people, and on the one hand, some of them say you shouldn't push the fat man. We can look at the processes, psychological, neural, that are associated with those kind of judgments. And we can draw this general conclusion about something, some psychological category called the ontological judgment, and maybe even draw some general conclusion about the nature of this philosophical approach to ethics. And the same thing on the utilitarian side, people who say that you should push, look at the brain processes, psychological processes, draw some general account of what this thing called utilitarian judgment is, some kind of interesting psychological category, and again, draw this general conclusion about ethics and maybe even support utilitarianism as Greene and Peter Singer think you can do. Now, the first assumption about ontology I may get to at the very end. I think it's not accurate, but it's not completely wrong. But this assumption about utilitarian judgment, I think it's just complete misinterpretation of what's going on here. And David has said some stuff that speaks to that, but I'll say a little bit more, pretty much that's going to be the main part of what I'll be speaking about. Just to highlight it, this assumption is obviously fundamental to what Greene is trying to do with this kind of account of the moral mind. It entirely assumes that you can draw these general conclusions about the ontological judgment, utilitarian judgment, just by looking at these Trolley cases. But lots of people in this literature make this assumption. I'll just give you a few examples. So people looking at frontal brain damage and then reporting that there's some utilitarian bias in people with this kind of brain damage because they are more inclined to push the fat man. Or kind of quotations or titles from recent papers in top journals in social and cognitive psychology about attachment anxiety predicts utilitarian judgment, or the drunk utilitarian, or upper class participants are more utilitarian, and things like that. You will find lots and lots of statements and titles of this sort using these phrases in this kind of way. One thing that, if you look at some recent evidence, to borrow a phrase from Greene himself, there's some kind of alarm bell that should start ringing. And a lot of that comes from some stuff that David and his colleagues did, and a few others. So this association between utilitarian judgment and antisocial traits like psychopathy. And as in the study that David reports from this work is really looking at ordinary people that just have some slight psychopathic traits. We've done similar studies, so it's not as these people are really psychopaths. Some of them actually very low on that scale, but just a bit higher than the rest of us. Or, not if I should say the rest of us, so higher than others on that scale. So just a little bit more callous, a bit more aggressive, a bit less empathetic. Some of these studies did look at clinical population of proper psychopaths. So you've got this kind of interesting result. It's a bit puzzling. And what's connected between psychopaths and utilitarianism? Psychopaths don't care about the greater good, they care about their own good, what's going on here. But it actually fits a whole pattern of results. So if you look at the people who are more inclined to make utilitarian judgment, what kind of stuff is associated with them? We talk about healthy individuals, so they're low on empathy, tend to have higher testosterone, low on emotional intelligence in one study. They have a weaker emotional physiological reaction to harm. There's a whole pattern of results here that kind of fits the psychopathy thing. We've done a kind of neuroimaging study, looked a little bit at that at the neural level, but I'll skip that. It's not that important. So people can misinterpret those kind of results, and this is something from The Economist that was really reporting David's study, concluding that because in these trolley dilemmas, some not so nice people are more utilitarian, so to speak, it follows that utilitarianism has nothing to do with goodness. It's a terrible inference. Even an undergraduate in 101 philosophy wouldn't make such a terrible inference. But really, the conclusion to draw is exactly in the opposite direction. If psychopaths tend to make these utilitarian judgments, then it's probably not a very good way to look at this way of thinking about ethics. There's some problem there. So you may wonder whether this paradigm really has anything to do with utilitarianism. Now, in a paper I published with my colleague Nick Shackle some years ago, in Minor Language, we already raised some purely conceptual words about connecting these trolley dilemmas to utilitarianism in any interesting sense. And I won't go into all of the details, but clearly the mere fact that some judgment of an ordinary person conforms to a judgment that some philosopher would make in that context is not something you can immediately draw the conclusion that that ordinary person is doing anything remotely similar to the philosopher. So you can't just immediately make this inference from the way these dilemmas are used in the philosophical context, and even this is something that psychologists tend to misinterpret, as I said, to anything that's going on in the ordinary psychology of common folk, so to speak. So why are people assuming that when people say that you should push the fat man, then you're making utilitarian judgment? Well, it seems to be people don't actually explain very clearly what they mean by utilitarian judgment. They just kind of cite Mill in the first paragraph of the paper, which is not very helpful. But they seem to mean that it's utilitarian because it involves giving, in the context of this special emergency situation, more weight to well-being than to some potential deontological constraint against harming in some direct way. And because it involves seeing more lives is morally better than fewer lives. Okay, that's all correct, but that has nothing to do with utilitarianism. They're really pedestrian new within what philosophers call common sense morality. I've developed this idea in a bit more detail in a recent paper in Social News. I won't go into the kind of nitty-gritty, but really these very pedestrian ideas, moral ideas, are so common. They have very little to do with utilitarianism in any interesting philosophical sense. What's really distinctive about utilitarian moral outlook is not that you give a bit more weight to numbers. Everybody does that in some context. It's this very radical and unusual idea that we're required, not just permitted, but required to maximize, not just 5 is better than 1, even 2 is better than 1, or 51 is better than 50. It's a very radical idea. We are required to maximize well-being, and we need to do it from this maximally impartial point of view. And finally, that this is the whole of morality. There's nothing else beyond that to morality. And that's a very radical idea that's very, very far from this completely pedestrian notion that are required to judge that you should push the fat man in the trolley case. So are people really utilitarian in this more radical sense? Well, if you look at the data, there's lots of hints that suggest that there's nothing of that kind. So if you give them the option to judge whether it's permissible to push the fat man or whether it's required, it will almost always go to permissible. So don't really judge that it's required the way utilitarian tells you should. They just say it's okay if you do, it's also okay if you don't, which is not at all the utilitarian view. The utilitarian tells you you have to push the fat man. As I said, people do endorse, some of them do supposedly make utilitarian judgment. They say you can push 1 to save 5, but how many would say that you can push 1 to save 2? Or, as I said, push 50 to save 51, which is what utilitarianism requires. As David mentioned, people sometimes go for the utilitarian option, but many of them would just go in a mixed kind of way. They do it in one case, but not in another, which again doesn't make any sense if you're, even in some implicit way, following some utilitarian way of thinking about ethics. People certainly not impartial, or it seems in the way they approach these dilemmas. They give priority to family, to their compatriots, to human beings versus animals in all kind of cases. Very far from the impartial ideal of utilitarianism. They report feeling guilty after making a utilitarian decision, which again doesn't make any sense from a utilitarian point of view because you're doing exactly the right thing. And when you give them the option of saying how wrong each of these options are, the majority of people said that both are wrong to some extent, which again, finally, doesn't really make sense on a properly utilitarian point of view. So there's a lot of evidence that suggests that what the research in this area described as utilitarian judgment is really misdescribed. I'll spend the rest of the time I have to quickly review some results from a study we published in Cognition not long ago. That it's a very simple study, correlational study or set of studies, very, very simple. But we just wanted to directly test this idea. So take these trolley dilemmas, these kind of push the fat man dilemmas, and then give people all kind of measures of things that would either indicate concern for the greater good of the kind that you would expect from utilitarian outlook, or the opposite, things that are opposed to a concern for the greater good. And just see what connections you find between these dilemmas and those other measures. So, for example, in one study, some of the study we asked people to say how much of it they got some unexpected bonus, and they could give some of it to help people in developing countries, how much they would give. In, I think, one of the studies we actually allowed them to give some of the fee that they were given to participate to such a charity. We give them a measure of something called an identification with humanity as a whole. So how much you identify with the whole of humanity as you'd expect a utilitarian to identify, or how much you just identify with yourself or your country or something very close and partial and nearby. We asked them what they think about egoism. Do you endorse being an egoist, or do you think that's the wrong thing? And a few similar measures. This is what we got. So the people who are tending to make the so-called utilitarian judgment, as other studies have shown, that was strongly correlated with psychopathy. Also correlated with explicit endorsement of egoism. So people who said that you should push the fat man try also to endorse the idea that the only rational thing is to promote your own self-interest. It's exactly the opposite view of a utilitarian view. And it was also negatively correlated with identification of the whole of humanity. So again, people who thought you could push the fat man didn't really identify with the whole of humanity as you may expect a utilitarian to. Judging you should push the fat man finally was also negatively correlated with how much money you said you would give to charity. So all the kind of thing you would expect to be associated with the utilitarian point of view were negatively correlated with those kind of judgment, and the opposite. We also look at all kind of ways in which people's judgments in these dilemmas, where they seem to be making utilitarian judgments, are actually highly sensitive to self-interest. So the same people who are willing to push the fat man may not be so willing to sacrifice themselves to save the five, for example, which is again what a utilitarian point of view would predict. So it looks like that all of this research that is looking at this supposedly utilitarian judgment, looking at these brain processes, let's say, that are associated with them, and then think that are studying something like the psychology of Peter Singer or some protopist Peter Singer. Actually, a lot of the time they're studying exactly the opposite kind of psychology, someone like Ayn Rand, the rational egoist. So exactly it's not just that it's not studying what it's trying to do, it's to some large extent studying exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to be doing, which is not very good, I think. Just a final bit of this really two studies, including in that paper that I'll briefly describe. But we really wanted to let's directly look at the kind of views or attitudes that are associated with a proper utilitarian view. So think about someone like Peter Singer, the kind of views that he and people like him endorse in their writings. And let's see what's the relation between those kind of views and these supposedly utilitarian judgments. So Peter Singer certainly, in writing, has endorsed the idea that you should push the fat man to save the five in this footbridge case, which is perfectly consistent. So utilitarians are willing to cause some very severe harm in order to lead to a greater good. That's certainly true. But that's not the core of the utilitarian view by any means. That's just a kind of side consequences of the overall view. The overall view has lots of other implications that are much more central. So in Peter Singer's case, that we should care to a far greater extent about animal welfare, that we should stop doing all kind of harmful things to animals just for very slight benefits to us. Care about the good of future generations and be willing to make very great sacrifices to prevent future harm. And most famous example associated with Peter Singer, the idea that if you don't give money to charity, it's pretty much morally identical to seeing this child in front of you drowning and not doing anything. So the idea that we should care about the whole of humanity in some equal way and be willing to make very great sacrifices to prevent harm to people, however far and distant, unrelated to you. Kind of basic, non-controversial ideas associated with the utilitarian outlook. So these are kind of pattern of thing that you would expect of someone with even a small utilitarian tendency to have at least a slight tendency in this direction. And we gave people those measures of those things and checked to see what would come up when you compare that to how they respond to the trolley dilemmas. Turns out, just to summarize very quickly, that, of course, these supposed trolley problem utilitarians are willing to harm someone to save a greater number. That's fine. That fits the utilitarian point of view. They also seem to have little problem with painful experiments in animals, even if they're not described as leading to any greater good. No problem with harming, whether or not it's for the greater good. And it turns out they have no special connection or special preference or tendency to care about helping suffering people in developing countries or distant people more generally or future generations, etc. And one thing that's quite important that all of this remains the case even if you control for the antisocial component that David described and I described earlier. So it's not just this psychopath group that is spoiling the picture, that if you remove them suddenly you get the proper utilitarians. Yeah, I mean, the psychopaths are even worse because they really don't care about what happened in faraway countries. But even if you remove that component of the supposedly utilitarian group, what remains is people, that are not higher psychopathy, but they're not particularly utilitarian in any other interesting sense either. We've also looked at that using kind of more rigorously devised vignettes that really kind of make it clear that the action you choose in a more utilitarian way would really lead to the greater good, so kind of set aside what kind of words about empirical ambiguities or whether your money to give to charity will really help enough people. Maybe some people have doubts about that, so we control for that. Again, got exactly the same results. Okay, so I ran through that very quickly. I'm going to discuss slightly more theoretical things before concluding. So like I said, some years ago, Nick Shackle and I raised some kind of general conceptual words about this whole paradigm of trolley dilemmas as a way of studying utilitarian judgment. And then over this past year, including in our own research, but research of others, this kind of suspicion, I think, has been confirmed in a far more dramatic way than we actually expected. It really turned out that when people are saying you should push the fat man, what they're saying is very little relation to anything that's usefully described as utilitarian. It's not the terminological point. I think it's actually a quite substantive and important point. Anyway, that's not at all surprising. That's again a point we already made back then. These trolley dilemmas, to the extent that they really present the contrast between utilitarian and non-utilitarian views, that's just one very specific, unusual point in which utilitarian views conflict with other countries. There are lots of other contexts in which utilitarianism is in conflict with common sense. So the idea, for example, we should give a lot of our money to charity and live in very minimal lives because there are people we can help in faraway countries. It's far more central to a utilitarian point of view than this trolley stuff. And that's a completely different way in which utilitarianism conflicts with common sense. So if you really want to measure some kind of proper utilitarian tendencies in ordinary people, you really need to look at a much broader range of contexts than in this very special one, and kind of very rashly generalized to some general category of utilitarian judgment, or the same applies to the logical judgment in slightly weaker form. So one thing that's kind of emerging from this study I just described, and I read some data, further data that confirmed that, although at the philosophical level, these different aspects of utilitarian implication of utilitarian really kind of flow from a single logical principle. In the psychology of ordinary people, this stuff comes apart in all kind of interesting ways and actually maybe in some tension. So on the one hand, you have a kind of tough-headed coldness, willingness to harm or break rules, and that pushes you in some context to something that looks like a utilitarian conclusion, But that may actually be in quite tension with the more positive side of utilitarianism, this idea should care about humanity as a whole, which we have data support now seems to be associated with a kind of strong empathic response. So you have this kind of, that's quite a very great distance from the kind of picture that Greene had of the utilitarian subsystem in the brain. It actually turns out that these are not subsystems of the brain, but you have these strong psychological tendencies in ordinary people that actually push them, the more they are pushed in one direction towards the utilitarian in one sense, they are pushed in the other direction in the other context. It just doesn't fit together in this ordinary, the psychology of ordinary people. So I'll quickly describe, we're engaging in several projects aiming to kind of develop more philosophically and conceptually appropriate ways of studying proto-utilitarian tendencies in ordinary people. And so by no means should that be the central business of moral psychology. Utilitarianism is a very kind of unusual kind of it's very interesting for philosophers to know where utilitarian came from. But if you're kind of just studying ordinary human moral psychology, it's not at all clear that anything to do with utilitarian should be a very central thing. But for us as philosophers, that's pretty interesting. So we did initiate some project of trying to find better, more rigorous ways of addressing that question. And like I said, in order to do so, you should look beyond the trolley context at a much broader range of things. So one project we did, which I'll describe, it's just one out of several, something that will hopefully become a kind of scale that measures utilitarian tendency. And what we did is simply did this very extensive literature review and input from philosophers, developed a long list of items that potentially distinguish utilitarian from non-utilitarian in very many contexts, and then had a range of philosophers, both utilitarian, including Peter Singer himself and other leading utilitarians and people on the other side, tell us what they thought about this item and how well they do that kind of job of distinguishing utilitarians from non-utilitarians. And we identified around 100 items that then about 1,000 people online rated how much they agreed to, and we did some factor analysis on that to identify the kind of item that really kind of distinguish or cluster around to really distinguish people's moral view. And the results we got, this is not final, but near final, pretty much fit this study I described earlier, that we actually found that there are these three main factors. The third one is less interesting, because it really identifies the kind of ultra-deontological views or conservative views that some people have. So it's kind of seen that are wrong just because they validate human dignity, even if they lead to better consequences. So this doesn't distinguish probably most people in this room. They can't distinguish people who are even more deontological than an ordinary person. But then there's these two separate factors that really, there's a very small statistical association between them, but they're pretty much independent, both conceptually and empirically. One is what you might call the positive side of utilitarianism, this idea that we should think about morality in a purely impartial way and be willing to make very great self-sacrifices. And then this more negative part, this willingness to harm people for the greater good. And as you'd expect, this kind of stuff is strongly associated with psychopathy, but this kind of stuff certainly isn't, while this kind of stuff is strongly associated with empathy, and this kind of stuff certainly isn't. So just an outline of how you would go about actually studying these proto-utilitarian tendencies in ordinary people. Certainly, ordinary people are by no means utilitarian in any kind of way. But if you are interested in that question, I think that would be the way to go. Nearly over. Finished. One thing I just kind of again also comes out from what I've just said. It's very often within philosophy, when people try to explain why utilitarians meet such resistance, the idea that, well, the problem is that, and that's kind of view that you find in people like Greene and many others, that people just have this very strong non-utilitarian intuitions and emotions, and that's why people resist utilitarianism. That's kind of an old view within utilitarianism going back to the 19th century. One thing that comes up from what I've just presented, maybe that's not the only reason why people resist utilitarian point of view. It might be that there's just this internal psychological tension between these more negative and positive sides of utilitarianism, this tough-headed side and this more caring side. They just don't go together very well in ordinary human psychology. Okay, so I've essentially argued that this big assumption of a lot of this research, that when we look at this supposedly utilitarian judgment, you should push the fat man, you can study something general about utilitarianism or utilitarian judgment. There's no such psychological category in ordinary people that's worth studying anyway. This whole assumption is seriously mistaken. And that's kind of not at all surprising when you think of it, because utilitarianism is a very recent theory, just a few hundred years old, developed in the West, never endorsed by more than a handful of people even today. Why would you think that that's a basic, useful, conceptual framing for studying the psychology of ordinary people? Why would you even start there? It's just not useful in any kind of way. I didn't say much about this other assumption, that you can use these dilemmas to study deontological judgment. Well, in some sense, that assumption is better. It's not entirely false. If you just mean non-utilitarian, then yes, common sense morality is full of these non-utilitarian constraints, and you can study them in this way. If you mean something like Kant and absolute prohibitions or categorical imperative, there's no relation between trolley dilemmas and that stuff. So trolley dilemmas are not entirely useless. I think they're overused, they're being misused, but they're useful for something very narrow and specific. They allow us to study this very specific deontological constraint relating to a certain kind of permissible harm in a certain kind of special context. But that's just one deontological constraint out of very many. And not particularly, it's an interesting one, but it's not particularly central to deontological view, not the only thing we can study if we want to study deontology. It's not even clear it's the best way to study this constraint, but it's a way to study it. It's not too bad. But the assumption we can learn something general about something called deontology by studying just these dilemmas, that's again a very weird assumption. Of course, if all you mean it, and someone finds psychologists saying that we've discovered that these deontological views are based on intuition. When in this I call the Cedric area, Cedric was saying that in the 19th century, it's something that every philosopher knows. You don't need neuroimaging to discover that very banal point about where these deontological constraints come from. It's just, we've come all around, I'm sorry. Concluding remarks. Once we drop this assumption that this trolley dilemma is always some kind of psychological key to this historical debate between utilitarians and deontologists, it just doesn't make any sense to see it as central to understanding ordinary moral psychology. Like I said, they're not useless. They can shed light on a kind of unusual way in which certain kinds of harms to others might be morally permissible, which is really tiny, pretty interesting, but pretty tiny corner in the entire moral domain. So that's what I think we should be doing with these dilemmas. Not useless, but certainly overused and misused.